I want to do a few videos on the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls of Revelation. I'm going to break them down into separate videos because of the amount of information that is in each of these entities. When it comes to the trumpets and the bowls, those are future events. All I can say is these are things that I'm looking for in those prophecies, because I don't believe, obviously, that we're in those as of presently. When it comes to the seals, the first thing to talk about when it regards to seals is 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3. Let no one deceive you until you see the anti-Messiah. All these things are just things that could fit. So even if I'm talking about these things, and even if you look and say, wow, that's happening from what I'm talking about is happening right now, that's just something that could fit. That doesn't mean it is fitting. A lot of these things have happened throughout human history, and it hasn't happened yet. And in fact, when I start talking about like the grand solar minimum, you're going to hear me say, well, this happened 400 years ago. Well, okay, well, they would have seen it 400 years ago, and it didn't happen then. So, we'll take it as that these are things that could fit. That's all it really is. And some of them are so, I won't say so vague, but I really am not going to spend that much time on them because everybody could point to this or that and say, well, that's where it's fitting. So, with that being said, let's take a look at the seals. They begin in Revelation 6, and the seventh seal is in Revelation 8. And I'm not going to get into the 144,000, which is going to be Revelation 7. I'm going to leave that out of this video. I could probably do something else on them, but I won't touch on them. This is just going to be the aspect of the seals. The first thing with regards to a seal is if you take a piece of paper, and I don't have one here, the only thing I've got rolled up is a small shofar, but to kind of give you an idea. So let's assume this is wrapped paper around this. And if I have a seal, I'd have a seal here, 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 and here. When I open, you could have multiple seals on the same piece of paper. Or you might have to have separate pieces of paper. But it just says the 7 seals. So it could be one piece of paper with 7 seals. As he opens them, they all pop off, so it's going to be very close in line. That's all I was trying to show, that it could be something very close in time as those things pop off, or it could be separate pieces of paper. We don't know. So let's look at those. They're going to be in Revelation 6. I watched the Lamb open the first of the 7 seals. Okay? So again, if you take the paper on the edge, and if it is one piece of paper, which we don't know, you can take it as you're opening, those things are going to pop off, and it's going to, one by one, but it's still going all at the same time as you're opening that piece of paper. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow and was given a crown, and he rode out to conquer, bent on conquest. This is the one that I'm not going to really comment on at all, because we can always see something with conquest. Are any of us going to be able to differentiate this conquest from the next conquest as to whether or not this is the horseman? I think our ability to do that would be so poor that it's not even worth mentioning. So it's there, it's the first seal. I'm going to leave that one alone. The second seal, which is in verse 3. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard a second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. Peace. Now that's something that's a little bit more problematic, because if we look at the world at large right now, there is no peace. I mean, almost every single nation is in turmoil. The United States government, for one, isn't at war with the United States government. The people are still okay, but the government is at war with the government. We have the White House is at war with the FBI and the Justice Department. These things have been trying to actually do a coup against each other. Most countries right now in the world are in turmoil. We've got turmoil, obviously. The easiest ones to look at are like Mexico and Brazil, countries that are basically run, unfortunately, by drug gangs. Venezuela, Colombia. I know someone from Colombia whose husband was actually running for what we would consider like a senator, like one of the four most powerful people in the country, and she was shot when he was executed, along with the, tr- the Secretary of the Treasury there, and I only mention that not because I statement of no one, but to get that inside information of how that country is actually run. And again, when you're run by the drug lords and gangs, the people just kind of exist, is the best way of saying it. And they're trying to get through, and some of them have to leave because if they'll sell their young daughters into prostitution. I can tell you that happens in Mexico, throughout a lot of Central America. They run through and they look for 13-year-old girls, and as soon as if they see one, they just take the girl. There's no payment as bringing these slaves in. It's just taking them and they sell them into prostitution. Africa, horrifying aspects. If you're buying chocolate, most of the chocolate comes from the Ivory Coast. That's actually done with child slave labor. It's almost all picked with child slave labor. So again, things are horrifying right now. But can we really pinpoint and say, well, that's something beyond? I think the things are worse now than they've been, but if you ask somebody 10 years ago, they would have said they were worse then than they've ever been. And 10 years prior, it was worse then than it's ever been. So we'll leave it at that. Now, the next one we can actually get somewhere and start looking at things, and that is Revelation 6, verse 5. Then the Lamb opened the third seal. I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures say, 2 pounds. I hate using the NIV. Let me actually get a better aspect on that. And I didn't do it there. Because I'm not even going to read something that is that horrifying. It's a chantix a week for denarius, and it's 3 chantix of barley for denarius. You have to actually break down what a chantix is and a denarius to determine the amount of silver. Now that's a fun little aspect to do. Again, if you're the type of person that likes that kind of stuff. And a chantix is about 1.92 pints of wheat. A denarius is 3.9 grams of silver. So obviously 3 chantix of barley is 3 times 1.92. We have so many people, for the academics who have tried to do the translations, who will say, well, that's the price of a day's wage. It doesn't say that. It says an amount for an amount of silver. So why are we trying to substitute things in there that are not said? I did the math that way, though, which took a lot to go through and find out the average daily wage of people in every single country, and then find the average for that. And then I had to average that on the amount of people per country. So obviously China, while they're, let's see, how did I do it? I think I did it for their monthly wage. And then I had to figure out that they were 18.41% of the population. Then I had to break that, and of the world's population, and then break that down so that I get an accurate statement of what the daily wage was. I did that, but other than going through the geekness of it, I would kind of stay away from it. Now, the first issue that I have is who is talking about the price? Where would that price be applicable? And the first thing that comes to my head is if he's talking about the price for wheat, because again, it's going to depend upon where you're at. If you're at a country that has to import everything, it's going to be higher than those that grow their own if they're able to grow enough to feed the people. So let's assume that I am in the island, like in Indonesia, where they probably don't grow grain. They're having to bring everything in. Their wheat prices are going to be higher. And so I believe this is going to actually be the price in Israel or Jerusalem. If he's given us a price, wouldn't that be the logical extension? I'm not saying it is, but I think it's a logical extension. Now that is an amazing issue because Israel, while it does produce grain and wheat and barley, it barely does. It doesn't satisfy any of its needs with regards to the wheat and barley. Israel imports at present, or I should say it was at present, 97% of their wheat. And 97% of their wheat comes from Russia and the Ukraine. So obviously, the price of wheat and barley in Israel is going to be dependent upon Russia and the Ukraine, since they are the ones who supply the wheat and barley. But now, the wheat that is grown in Israel took a drastic hit in 2018. It went from 142,000 metric tons to 50,000 metric tons. In most years, about 90% of the wheat is imported, but it just went to 97%. And I'm going to show you where this really goes, unfortunately. In September of 2018, Russia banned all exports of wheat. So the price of wheat in Israel right now is going up because one of their two suppliers just banned all exports to all countries, not just Israel, to all countries, which left Ukraine. And Ukraine is supplying Egypt, Syria, the Middle East, and a number of other countries. In I think they were August 2018, Ukraine capped all exports of wheat to 16 million metric tons. So what was 97% of, and that's to all countries, and it's 16 million metric tons. So therefore the wheat that goes to all countries is capped. So Israel, which had Russia and Ukraine, one of those falls off completely and the other is capped. So the price in Israel is shooting up. Now, let's look for the next aspect on that. Now, and I'll go back and talk about the remainder of the third horseman because it says leave the wine and the oil. Let's pull that up real quick. Do not damage the oil and the wine. It doesn't say don't damage the olive and the grape, just the oil and the wine. Now that's an interesting thing. Why is that? Because wine has already been harvested. It is already in barrels. So it's not harming the items before, but it certainly can for that last crop. And why do I say that? Because then we look at Isaiah 5, 5:26. Now we know that Isaiah 5 is talking about the second Exodus, of the period of that, or the return of the exiles. So, but in verse 10, and this is really why I'm going to stay with verse 10, Isaiah 5:10. For 10 semed, T-S-E-M-E-D, which is an amount of land that can be plowed by 2 oxen in a day. They estimate that's about an acre. So I'm not saying it is, it's going to be somewhere close to that. So we'll use the word acre, but even though recognize the word was semed. 10 acres of a vineyard will produce a vat of wine, which is about 9 gallons. Now, If you have 10 acres and you only produce 9 gallons, you have had a horrifyingly bad harvest. And then a homer of seed, which is about 65 gallons, shall yield 1 ephah, or 9 gallons of grain. So the more you put into the ground, the worse off it is for you at that last time, because it is not going to produce. It's going to be a negative yield. What would happen with that? Well, as you can imagine, the prices would skyrocket. So, all right, so we've got a little bit of a background for the third horseman of what's going to happen to the ground at this last time. Now let's look at what's actually happening right now. Now again, does what's happening right now mean that this is what's going on? I don't want to say that. It could be, it could fit. So right now we watch. Until we see the Anti-Messiah being revealed, all it is us watching. We have right now what is called the Grand Solar Minimum, and that is the largest thing that I see right now for the watch that is going on. And I make that comment because of the tremendous implications of this Grand Solar Minimum, which is just a lack of sunspots. I mean, if you look it up, you're like, what in the world, why would this make a difference? And sure, it gets a little bit colder during a Grand Solar Minimum, but, you know, if you're, let's assume you live in Virginia and it gets down, and you're in the mountains and it gets down to around 9 degrees during the cold parts of the winter. If it gets down to 5 degrees, if you really cared that much, no. Is it going to really do that much to the ground? No, because we have cold snaps that go down. It's not that big of a deal. If your summer is, you know, again, if you're in the mountains and it gets up to about 80 degrees and it's only going up to 75, is that going to make that much of a difference? I would say basically probably not. You know, that's Virginia, but they grow things in Pennsylvania and New York, so what's the difference? The real issue is it's not that temperature difference as much as it changes the climate around it, specifically when the rain comes. And so when we're having to harvest and when we have to plant, we're having rain occur. Well, you can't plant in rain, you can't harvest in rain. You got to be dry for both of those. That's what really is changing things. So it's not just this slight difference of the temperature. You almost have to say even, who cares? Now there's a graph that I pulled up from Canada, which produces so much of our wheat. And in the last number of years, as the earth has gotten warmer, and I'm not going to get into to the global warming garbage, because they only did that so they could tax you. That's why they kept saying, oh, this is what is going on, so we need to save the earth. Well, they didn't care about the earth, they just wanted to tax you more. So, but the earth was getting warmer, but it had nothing to do with what they were saying. And so they expanded in Canada where they're growing wheat. But a few degrees difference in Canada drastically changes the amount that they're able to harvest. And in fact, a 4-degree temperature difference, which is what we're probably looking at for this Grand Solar Minimum, will reduce 90% of their land that is available for growing wheat. So only 10% of the land is actually available. Now, that's a problematic issue in itself. And I think we can start seeing Isaiah 5 come out there. If the land is not really usable land because it has gotten colder and you're planting there, you're not getting anything. Whereas somebody who's in that 10%, they may plant it, they might get some things out of the ground, but the average is you're losing. So it's just one of those issues. Now, the Grand Solar Minimum is a lot more important than just the changes of the temperature and the changes of the climate with regards to when it rains and floods. And we obviously saw a huge issue in the Midwest of the United States this year in the Midwest flooding. It also changes the lines of I'll say magnetic lines that come out from the sun. Because of those, And again, we have the same thing from the Earth that comes out. But because of these changes, it actually is throwing out flares. Now those flares, what happens is once they hit the Earth, they actually hit it hard enough to slow it down just a little bit. Okay, so they'll slow it. And what happens when you have something that is a ball, and if you're a flat earther, just forget about this because this won't apply to you. But if you're anywhere else and you have a ball that is spinning, and inside the ball is liquid that is spinning, and on the top you have this crust, and you hit that ball with a force, okay, it slows down the top, the crust. Well, the spinning force in the inside is still spinning at the same speed, so that twist and that torque creates earthquakes and volcanic activity, tremendous earthquakes and volcanic activity. And that's a scientific issue that they talk about now. And this is going to fall more towards the fourth horseman, but I might as well bring it up while I'm talking about the grand solar minimum. And then I'm going to go back and show how these things play itself out in the grand solar minimum. The other aspect is the grand solar minimum actually brings disease. Now, we started talking about crop issues and loss, and obviously each time we've had a grand solar minimum in the past, we've had reduced crops because again, a solar minimum happens every 11 years, a grand solar minimum is every 200, and then there's a special grand solar minimum that's every 400 years. We are certainly in the 400-year period. There might be another one beyond that, which makes it even worse that we could be in, but we're at least in the 400-year grand solar minimum. And the last time you had this, you had that thing called Black Death that was going through Europe. So it's a big deal because that change brings a loss of crops, which brings, again, when you're not eating right, the chances of being sick and having diseases goes up substantially. But what I want to bring out is that there's a grand solar minimum also brings with it extra diseases and viruses and bacteria from outer space. And I know that sounds just crazy, but they have this scientifically. The Journal of Astrobiology and Outreach, June 23rd, 2017, Sunspot Cycle Minima and Pandemics, the Case for Vigilance. And what they say in that is that there are what's called galactic cosmic rays that have viruses and bacteria in them. And when you have a grand solar minimum, those galactic cosmic rays come deeper down into Earth, bringing the viruses and bacteria to Earth. New viruses and new bacteria that we've not had, we don't have any immunity to, and all of a sudden we get sicker with. What it does is it comes down to about 17 kilometers from the crust, from the Earth. We'll say from 17 kilometers up in the atmosphere, and then it starts, and that's where the galactic cosmic rays put this stuff, and then it just starts trickling down from there. So it slowly comes down after that point. But a grand solar minimum brings disease in and of itself. Now, again, as I said, when you're not eating, you have diseases that come up from not eating, you get sicker. So we have a double whammy that comes from a grand solar minimum. Is this a third horseman? We don't know. We're just watching. And actually, I said 17 kilometers. It's actually anywhere from 16 to 20 kilometers is what the Journal of Astrobiology and Outreach indicated. And I said viruses and bacteria. It's also other microscopic biological entities that can penetrate the interplanetary magnetic field barrier and reach the stratosphere. So therefore, it's going to come down first into the mountains. They're the first ones that are going to get this. There is also, I don't want to deal with that one right. This guy's name, I'm not going to be able to pronounce. It's a Russian scientist, Chizhevsky. a horrible thing, and I have dated a Russian for years, and my entire knowledge of Russian is shashpradu, which is what she says to the dog when she leaves, which is "I'll be back." So a dog knows more Russian than I do. Anyway, that's where they plotted. Okay. This scientist looked at the connections between solar variations in weather and impact on human activity, and specifically he correlated this with war. When you start having a famine, you have an increased aspect of war. So he went back for 2,422 years, covered 72 different countries, and looked at how aspects of famine affect war. And obviously, his findings show a tremendous increase in war. Well, what did we just talk about in the first horseman? So if you start playing with the third horseman, he starts affecting the other things as well. If you're hungry because you're not eating and there's no food and your food prices are incredibly high, and the money that you were spending on electricity and water and everything else, and your car payment and your insurance, now you're spending it just to get food, then your stress level goes up. So the third horseman really affects the other two drastically. Now in December 2012, senior economist Arborelza Abizan of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organizations expressed ongoing concern about the continuing downward trend in the level of world grain stores. And in last year, it became listed as a critical event because they're just too low right now. That is hidden from the average person because, again, if you're a farmer and you're harvesting this, you put it into the storehouse, you sell it when the price is good. But the levels that we have in storage have continued to decrease, and they're not being replenished. That's a factor. I don't know if I want to. Now, the other aspect is other scientists have actually shown that you find a scapegoat when you start having solar minimum. And this is something that we do need to discuss. One example of violent scapegoating occurred during the Little Ice Age, which is one of the solar minimums, was the resurgence of witchcraft trials. Historians have argued that Jewish populations were also blamed for climate deterioration during the Little Ice Age. Now, that last little part should have really prickled our ears for those of us in faith. If it is starting to blame the Jews, which again, look at what's happening right now in our society. We've got the Epstein situation, and they're trying to say, well, he was an agent of the Mossad, the Israeli, basically an Israeli spy. In France right now, they have been protesting for just short of a year. They've been protesting for 10 months with the yellow vest. It doesn't make it in our news, but they have continued steadfast for 10 freaking months in France. They blame Rothschilds, the Jews, who own the banks, for the situation that they have. I mean, you can start seeing this stuff really play out. Why is that? Because the end, when the Anti-Messiah is revealed, is going to be when Israel is invaded by a number of nations. And if they're invaded by a number of nations, the animosity must be high. Now, all these things, if you've got scapegoating going on, if you have, and again, we can start seeing that now, we can start seeing it building. Our Congress right now, we're putting the Democratic Party, which used to be the party for the Jews, is now the party for the Muslims. So the Jews are being cut out from our society right now, and it's just something to watch because I see this building as a crescendo. I'll leave the grand solar minimum at that point. And now let's look at the fourth horseman. And then I'll even go back and look at Jeremiah 30 on this, but let's look at the fourth horseman. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Pale horse is a horrifying translation. It is actually the color of new grass. New grass would be a bright green. So where they get pale when it should be bright, who knows? Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given a power over the fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Now the average person reads this and probably says, what's wild beast got to do with this? I think the wild beast is the largest issue in that verse. And let's look at the word used for wild beast. Let's see. Did I do that? The word for beast is therion. It is any animal that is unclean. So wild beast is any unclean animal. Now what happened during the last grand solar minimum, the 400 year, we had the fleas on the rats that carried the disease. I think we're going to have a little bit different in this one. And why do I say that? Because of an amazing thing right now, and amazing is used in the exact opposite aspect for a definition, a horrifying thing. We have a thing called African swine flu, or African swine fever right now, that is crossing the earth, killing off pigs. Now, if you look at any of the information on it, what they always say is this is not harmful to humans yet. But it kills the pigs. They have lost over, China is the #1 producer of pork in the world. They've lost half of their pigs in the past year and a half to this African swine flu. That's how devastating it is. It is wiping out these animals. And they're selling these animals. Because why just throw them away? I mean, it's meat, so the fact that it died from a disease doesn't really bother them. And our United States has caught this pork from China with the African swine flu at the Canadian border. That should not give you any indication of, oh, our meat is somewhat safe because they caught it. And this is why. They did a study a couple years ago from the shrimp that was coming to the United States. And in any ship that was inspected for shrimp, which most of them are not inspected, but those that were inspected, 97% of the shrimp failed to meet safety and were rejected. 97% of all the shrimp that is brought in, China, Indonesia, all these countries, 97% is not fit for human consumption and is rejected at the port. Well, what does the boat then do with the shrimp? So let's assume it came into New York Harbor and it was inspected and it's rejected. That's fine. They then turn around and they go down to Norfolk, Virginia, or they go down to Savannah, Georgia. And as long as they're not inspected, it still comes in. This meat that has been rejected is still coming into the United States. The fact it's been rejected means nothing to them. It just means, oh, there's a little bit extra gas as I go somewhere else. That's it. That's how bad this stuff is. So if you think, oh, wow, they caught this stuff at the border trying to come in from Canada with African swine flu or African swine fever, it doesn't mean anything. It's still coming in. They just caught it one time and it's okay. They'll still come in. And most of the stuff is never inspected, so most of it is coming in. So I can guarantee you right now, if you're trying to buy pork, you're buying a disease. Imagine how bad that is when the galactic cosmic rays are bringing in those viruses and bacteria and It's also it's shooting some rays down, which are actually even mutating the diseases that we have on Earth. I didn't mention that, but it does that as well. So again, grand solar minimums all over the place here. Now, if I'm looking at the Creator and how he, again, I love to read, and it lets me kind of see the personality of what he at least shows me of his personality. And if he is saying, do not eat pork, do not eat shellfish, and we do it anyway, what's he going to do? As he's already saying here in the fourth horseman that that's going to bring out some aspects of disease. I absolutely see that playing out where he'd say, fine, you want to eat it, I'll just make it diseased. I can kill you from it. That's fine. 25% of the world dies on that. Now, that's an amazing word. You don't hear him say in the fourth horseman that he kills them. Specifically at that time, he says, given authority to do it. Authority is a huge issue because that may happen after we leave. It's obviously going to start before we leave, but he doesn't have to kill all 25% before we leave on the Passover at the midpoint. And I think that's there so people will kind of not see this coming up. If you're saying, okay, I know that the fourth horseman is there, and 25% of the world has to go, and 2% of the world died last year. I'm not saying that's the correct number. I'm just throwing that out for example. 2% died. Well, I know that's 2% is not 25%. I don't have to worry about it. We're not in the tribulation. But you don't really know that because it's just the word given authority to do it. He can do it at any time he wants because he's given authority. So again, I think this issue of the beast is a much larger issue than I think of the war and the famine. And we know the famine's coming. Sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beast. I think, remember, there should be commas in there. So I actually believe, I bet you the plague there is from the wild beast. Greek doesn't have commas. So, and so when they put it in the translations, they'll add that comma and some language in there to make it fit. But it very easily could be, and plague by the wild beast. Just something to think about. There's another issue. We have described the horses, and they are each given a color. We have white, red, black, and bright green. Remember, pale green is a horrible translation. It's the color of new grass. That is the color of Muslim flags. Take it for what you will. Not all of them, but many of them have those colors. From Lebanon to Egypt to Iraq, Syria, Jordan. Look. Actually, is Syria in there? I'd have to go back and look. It's throughout a lot of the countries, for the Muslim countries, have those colors. So, just an interesting thing. Does that mean something? The Creator put the colors in there. It means something. Is that what it means? I don't know. It's just something to think about. Now we'll go to the fifth seal. He opened the fifth seal, and I saw under the altar of the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony and that they had maintained. They cried out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" And then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. This should be screaming to people, Sheol, or the abyss, which is where the people are kept until final judgment. Now, are these saints here, are they the ones who are in the first resurrection? And that is, no, they're not. Now, can I prove that? I can. I can look at Revelation 20, and it indicates that the ones who are in the first resurrection are those who are beheaded for failure to accept the mark of the beast. And if that weren't good enough, I also have Revelation 14:3. Blessed who are those who die from now on, because that's the start of those that will get into that first resurrection. And that's 14:3 is after the trumpets. So you have to make it all the way through past the trumpets before you get into first resurrection. That's the time frame from if you're going to be in the first resurrection, which are those who are not on the Exodus with us. It's an interesting thing. I can't imagine somebody's going to die who's on the Exodus with us, not in a war at least. So I guess you could actually be on the Exodus and still qualify for this because of the timing. That would be a big jump because I don't think we're going to lose anybody in any of the wars that we have. So if you're not in the Exodus, and the idea is I'm going to be in the first resurrection, they just have to behead me, you still have to make it all the way through trumpets. That's your penalty for not going with the group. So if you make it to the bowls, then you, and of course you have to die before the return of the Messiah. Those are your two criteria. You can be in the first resurrection. And we can see that in Revelation 2 and 3. Specifically, we have the persecuted church, which is the second church, where it says, okay, they'll throw you in prison, but don't worry, it's only going to be 10 days. Why is it going to be 10 days? They're not releasing you in 10 days. And it also says, I'll tell you what to say. We can also see that in Revelation, and I'm not trying to get into this for the seals, but just to complete the thought, we can see it in Revelation 12 when Satan is out persecuting and trying to flood those who are in the Exodus, and when it doesn't work, he goes out to persecute the remainder of those who, or it says even the remnant of those who still keep God's commands. So why is that? Is this because they didn't leave on the Exodus? Again, I'm not trying to get into that. I don't know why I started with that. So that's our fifth seal. And then we've got the sixth seal. And again, I hope we can start seeing as well in the sixth seal what I just talked about with, again, grand solar minimum. I think it's the biggest thing right now that's happening. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. And the stars fell to the sky as figs dropped from the fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then everybody's hiding, trying to get in caves. Let's deal with that. We have one of the first things we should be looking at there. Where do I have that here? Because there is an interesting issue, and that is that I was looking up if we're dealing with that type of, again, it says a blood moon. Okay. Are there any blood moons in the next 100 years over top of Israel? Are there any eclipses that are planned to happen over Israel? Because if he's going to say it, the location, I know people in our faith have said, well, there's this cross of the eclipse over top the center part of the United States. Well, and that's got to be some prophecy. Why is that some prophecy? Is the United States now part of Israel? No, we're not. So why is he giving some prophecy to us? That happens. The cross happens it's always separated, I think it's by 6 months. And so if you got one in one location, you're going to have it in the other. So those things happen. But there are only partial solar eclipses during the next 100 years in Jerusalem. I went through 100 years in the future. And there's a blood moon in 2018, 2019, and September 2025 in Jerusalem. Are any of these things what we would look at as prophetic dates? We've already went past the one, because the one in 2019 was January 2019. We've already went past that. The next one that's going to occur is September 2025. So nothing really for the blood moon that way. But there's another way to do a blood moon, and that is if you've got ash or lots of dirt in the sky, you'll actually make a blood moon. And you can do that with a volcanic eruption. So something to think about. It just said you're going to have these earthquakes. Everything's being moved. If everything's being moved, that should be screaming at you. You know, again, earthquake, and an earthquake should trigger volcanoes. That's what it does. So the fact that people are looking to say, well, where's the eclipse happening? It doesn't have to be eclipse. It just has to darken. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. It just has to darken it. Volcano can do that easily with ash. There are other things that can happen that can also do the same thing, but that is the most likely is actually maybe a volcanic eruption. And that's just something to think about. That again, for those who are looking to say, well, this has got to be in the sky on this particular point. No, it's probably going to be on the ground on that particular point, except for the heavens receding and the sky and the stars, which kind of tells me that's probably an aspect of a meteor shower, and then the heavens receding. What that means, we'll have to look and see. It goes in the 144,000. I don't want to get into that for the purpose of this. And then the seventh seal, which is in chapter 8, and just silence in heaven for about a half an hour, and that's when they give out the trumpets. So that is my statement on the seals. Just because we see something happening does not mean diddly, because this is all prior to the infanticide. These are just things that potentially can fit and things that should prickle our ears a little bit, make us stand up and do a little bit of watching. I think all of this is vastly outweighed by the fact that he's waking up people in our faith right now. That's a million times more indicative that we are in the last days than any of these things that we would see. Again, there's been grand solar minimums in the past. I don't know that 25% of the earth being just, killed because of things that are going on, from the war, the famine, and the plagues. I don't think we've seen that before. But again, that doesn't mean that all has to occur and finalize itself before the midpoint when we would leave. So that's what I have on the seal. I actually have a lot more when it comes to, for some of the issues on the trumpets and bowls. Thank you.